Thank you. Good morning, everyone, to the dialogue, and welcoming you all to the dialogue on the National Climate Change Response Fund, hosted by the Presidential Climate Commission. The Presidential Climate Commission is an independent multi-stakeholder body established in 2020 by the President of South Africa to give advice on a just and equitable transition to a low carbon and climate resilient society. This commission emanates from the Presidential Climate Summit held in October 2018, when social partners agreed that a statutory entity should be formed to coordinate and oversee the just transition towards a low carbon, inclusive, climate resilient economy and society. The commission comprises of government ministers and commissioners that represent diverse social partners, including academia, business, civil society, labor, and youth. The Presidential Climate Commission is hosting this public dialogue on the topic of a National Climate Change Response Fund as a mechanism to mobilize public and private investment to address the adaptation funding gap. In the last 3 years, South Africa has faced increasingly severe and more frequent climate disasters, often simultaneously across the country. We have experienced wildfires in the Western Cape, heat waves in the Northern Cape, continuing drought condition in the Eastern Cape, and high energy storms in Gauteng. Even before the country could adequately recover and rebuild after the 2022 floods, in KwaZulu-Natal, the region was again hit with extreme weather with devastating impacts, further loss of life, and immense damage to livelihoods, property, and the local economy. Alarming signals from the insurance industry relating to the escalation cost of disaster risk finance, and even talk of the prospect of highly vulnerable regions eventually becoming uninsurable in the wake of climate change is increasingly concerning. Along with the achievements of the Africa Bloc and the G77 China Group in securing an agreement at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to set up a loss and damage fund, there is an urgent need to mobilize funds at a national level for adaptation. These measures relate to both immediate response measures to minimize loss of life and property and assist with the post-event livelihood restoration, as well as long-term investments in building climate resilience. Investments need to build back better in a manner that is more resilient so that the next event has a much lower damage and impact. As a direct response to climate disasters and in recognition of the increasingly vulnerability of South Africa to climate risks, the President, in the February 2024 State of the Nation address, announced that, to quote him, to address the persistent effect of global warming, which manifests themselves through persistent floods, fires, and droughts, we have decided to establish a climate change response fund. This will bring together all spheres of government and the private sector in a collaborative effort to build our resilience and respond to the impacts of climate change. This fund may deploy several instruments, including grants for loss and damages, as well as recovery, leveraging public and private investments in priority sectors such as food security, water security, and infrastructure, and other innovative instruments and modalities. So this dialogue today aims to present the findings from a survey of the literature and expected views that has been done by different sectors, but also solicit input by stakeholders on various aspects of the climate change response funds. In this dialogue, we aim also to explore opportunities and constraints linked to the front and provide a platform for sharing knowledge and experience. So I hope this is one of the first of the dialogues or discussions around the National Climate Change Response Fund. And today we're going to have this dialogue with a number of people who have also done or have made a survey or also have explored what this climate change response fund could look like or what modalities should look at. Before we start with the actual debate, dialogue, reports from those who have been doing research, I would like to welcome the Honorable Minister Naren Singh, and welcome to the dialogue, Mr. Singh. And just a brief introduction of Mr. Singh. Honorable Mr. Singh, he was appointed as a Deputy Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment from the 3rd of July this year. Welcome to the space, Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh is also a member of the National Assembly representing the Inkatha Freedom Party. He's got a long-standing career in public service. Mr. Singh has been an influential figure in South African politics, particularly known for his advocacy on social and economic issues. Mr. Singh's legacy in South African politics is marked by his integrity, dedication, and unwavering commitment to the principles of democracy and social justice. He remains a key player in the political arena, working towards a more inclusive and prosperous South Africa. And by way of academic backgrounds, he holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the University of Durban, Westville. Mr. Singh, may I invite you to provide your welcoming remarks and the keynote on this dialogue. Thank you. The floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, Ms. Lekalakala. I hope everybody can hear me quite clearly. As you've set the scene, I mean, you've also said that I'm a new kid on the block as far as the being Deputy Minister of this department. But I think Dr. Crispian Oliver and my old friend of old, Mr. Bali Musa, if they are online, well, I saw Dr. Oliver. My interest in the environment spans, more than 30 years. When I was the MEC for Environment in KwaZulu-Natal from 1997. So I think this is just an upgrade now at the national level. But thank you very much for inviting me and requesting me to share some thoughts on this at this dialogue. And welcome to Honorable Vali Musa, if he's with us now, the other commissioners that are present, Dr. Oliver, the Executive Director, representatives of different agencies and organizations, and I note that some are international participants. Welcome to you, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and pleasure for me to be participating in this first dialogue on the National Climate Change Response Fund. And as you would know, it is well known that climate change impacts have intensified and manifested through the frequencies of extreme events such as flooding, heat waves, drought, to mention but a few, particularly in South Africa and on the continent, as well as globally. These extreme events have increased in intensity and frequency, thus calling for concerted action across the spheres of society. The State of Climate Action Report developed by the Presidential Climate Commission and launched on the 25th of July underscores that the just transition is central to South Africa's response to climate change, which puts the lives and livelihoods of people at the heart of its climate response to ensure that the most vulnerable and impacted are protected, supported, and empowered in the transition. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, a just transition to a low-carbon economy will make South Africa's economy more resilient and strengthen the country's global competitiveness, which will create opportunities to reduce poverty, inequality, and unemployment, which are the priorities of the past government and this government of national unity. The report further points to the limited investment from both the public and private sector for the implementation of South Africa's climate change response. Indeed, this is a clarion call for collaboration between private sector and public sector in upscaling investment for climate change responses in the country. We are all well aware that climate change has the potential to reverse the developmental gains achieved thus far in the country. And as such, collaboration and strategic partnerships with the civil society, academia, business, labor is necessary in responding to climate change. Considering the significant risks South Africa faces because of climate change, such as the floods, droughts, heat waves, etc., which I've mentioned earlier on, national policies and commitments have set out a comprehensive approach to building climate resilience. Furthermore, South Africa has set ambitious goals for climate action, namely for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that drive global warming and for adapting to the impacts of climate change. Some of these include the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy developed in 2019, the Nationally Determined Contribution, also 2019, the Just Transition Framework and the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, developed in 2022, the Draft 2024 Sectoral Emissions Target report and the signing into law of the Climate Change Act, as well as the publication of the report of the State of Climate Action in South Africa by the PCC in July 2024. However, despite these recent policy and legislative developments in South Africa, the availability of finance to fund climate action remains inadequate and insufficient. Although climate finance flows have grown significantly in recent years, these still fall short of what South Africa requires annually to reach its climate targets. The World Bank estimated the total cost of decarbonization, adaptation, and just transition measures until 2050 will be approximately 8.5 trillion. It is clear, it is clear that South Africa needs access to scaled up, new, additional, and predictable fit-for-purpose finance, specifically grant and concessional finance, that can be deployed effectively to create enabling environments for rapid investments by buying down risks and create new asset classes for clean investments that would allow for more significant mobilization and leveraging of public and private finance. And we feel to respond in a holistic manner to the threats posed by climate change, President Ramaphosa rightly announced in his State of the Nation address in February 2024 the establishment of the Climate Change Response Fund that will bring together all spheres of government and the private sector. By coordinating financial mobilization and, might I also say, human resource mobilization from both government and the private sector through the fund, South Africa will leverage on collaborative efforts to build resilience and respond to climate change. It is pleasing to note, ladies and gentlemen and delegates, that dialogue is being convened soon after the signing into the law of the climate change bill by President Ramaphosa on 23rd July. And I was very pleased to be involved in the public outreach programs on the climate change bill, having been a member of that committee for 10 years. And there were some very interesting ideas that were given to us by members of the public, which I think we need to harness as we move forward. The Climate Change Act enables the alignment of policies that influence South Africa's climate change response to ensure that South Africa's transition to a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy and society is not constrained by policy contradictions. The Climate Change Act also sets out measures to enhance South Africa's ability and capacity over time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build climate resilience while reducing the risk of job losses and promoting new job opportunities in the emerging green economy. The Climate Change Act, which we are currently working towards its implementation, will ensure integrated and coherent climate change response in the country. It should also be noted that the Act includes the finance mechanism to support and finance a country's climate change response, including planning and implementation by national, provincial, and local government. Therefore, this provides a legal mandate for the establishment of the Climate Change Response Fund. The fund is therefore envisaged to form an important part of South Africa's comprehensive response to climate change, which includes both adaptation and measures to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Within this context, the delegates, the CCRF is intended to aim to maximize climate resilience of existing expenditure while simultaneously catalyzing and mobilizing private capital and investments to finance South Africa's response to the adverse effects of climate change, including rapid weather events and slow onset events, as well as rehabilitation, recovery, and reconstruction. In conclusion, it is imperative that the Climate Change Response Fund is established and operationalized in a phased manner as soon as possible. I look forward to fruitful deliberations and receiving your inputs on the design of this fund, as well as proposals on options for its possible form, modality of operation, and funding mechanisms. And lastly, remember, we are in this together for future generations. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Singh. I think your opening remarks actually set up the scene for this dialogue, but also it is a call for action, particularly your conclusion that this needs to be done as soon as possible so that we can be able to respond to the threats that, the climate threats that we're facing today. I am going to give over to Deshkan Naidu to facilitate the next session and also the discussions thereafter. Deshkan, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Once again, welcome, Deputy Minister Singh. I know that you have a long record in both the legislature and executive, but regard this as a formal welcome into the climate club that is the PCC and its multiple partners across the country and indeed across the world. And thank you for your really encouraging message. It's putting substance to a really interesting idea that we want to explore and exploit in order to get us to our next level of climate resilience, both in the South African system, but I should emphasize that South Africa also operates as part of a regional club, as part of the African club, as part of the developing world club, and of course we want to contribute to the world as a whole, getting its act together onto a low carbon trajectory. In order to launch this more technical part of the discussion, we're going to start with a presentation. The PCC, with the support of primarily the two principal government departments of DFFE and the National Treasury, but with the participation of many more players, both in government as well as in the different stakeholder groups, have come together to do a very concentrated analysis of this concept. So we're going to start off by first looking at a short presentation on where we have gotten to around the analysis before we move into a panel discussion and a broader discussion to our colleagues that have joined us online. So Mandy, you are representing the team of the PCC and the UCT group. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Desigan. Good morning to the Deputy Minister, to the PCC commissioners present today, our colleagues at the DFFE, colleagues at the National Treasury and the PCC, and a special welcome to the project team at the University of Cape Town and the stakeholders joining us this morning. I will be taking you through a very brief presentation, as Desigan says. Apologies. There we go. So we will be talking about 5 key areas. And the first is the introduction, which basically describes the context and the thinking behind the conceptualization of this National Climate Change Response Fund. I think some of the context, both Madam Lekhalekhala as well as the Deputy Minister have very, very eloquently described already. Also, the aim of the study. The third section is the key findings. We will look at the macro considerations and some fund modalities, and the next steps. In terms of the introduction, so South Africa has faced significant challenges in securing sufficient capital to effectively address adaptation responses to climate change. I think the minister alluded to this. Particularly, what we found is this has been concerning when we look at extreme events. The country has also recognized the need for a comprehensive approach to climate change adaptation, which includes the mobilization of financial resources from various sources, including domestic budgets, international funding, and private sector investment. Even as far back as the Climate Change Response White Paper, there was emphasis on the importance of integrating climate considerations into financial systems. It highlighted the role of public finance, development finance institutions, the private banks in mobilizing resources for climate adaptation, but also these institutions together are crucial, together with private sector, are crucial for sustainable technologies and instituting climate resilient infrastructure. As a developing country, South Africa cannot shoulder the burden for climate change on the country's balance sheets alone. And for this reason, we must leverage international finance opportunities in a coordinated and cohesive manner, particularly when in competition with other countries under mechanisms established under the UNFCCC, apologies. So I think we've seen this quote a number of times. And what Madam Lekhalekhala has alluded to is that we need a national response and we need it now. And this is to make funds available for emergency measures, both finance and responding to mechanisms to minimize loss of life, of property, and then also rapid assistance to assist affected communities and vulnerable groups, to raise investment needs to build back better and more resilient so that the next event has a lower impact and significance, to secure the right investments to ensure a higher level of disaster reduction. And this follows the Sendai framework, where it looks at preventing the creation of new risk, reducing existing risk, and increasing resilience. And to create local partnerships, both locally and across various partnerships. For example, the Santiago Network, which looks at drawing down from the developed world more direct resources in capacity building and technical assistance. So the aim and the methodology, it was a fairly short assignment, and it aimed at taking stock of the landscape and providing an initial concept of this National Climate Change Response Fund. So the methodology included a desktop review of over 30 plus funds. So we observed the trends and the pros and the cons of the different modalities and operational approaches. There were 2 expert group sessions which were held. We're trying to solicit views from seasoned professionals in demand side, supply side, and the intermediary space. I must say this was a very, very difficult process given we were working with a blank canvas and there were so many views in the room. But I think the common threads did come through eventually. And finally, we're here at this public dialogue, which we will continue to try to solicit additional views including findings of this dialogue, as well as the previous studies and the stakeholder engagements will inform our recommendations to the National Treasury as well as the DFFE. What I would like to say is that the DFFE has been, together with the Bertha Center, have been very instrumental in driving this process forward with the PCC. When we look at the key findings, I think there's a really nice diagram here, and it looks quite busy, but the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what are we aiming to do with this fund? And I think in the quote of the president from the SONA, it is quite evident. He states, we have decided to establish a climate change response fund This will bring together all spheres of government and private sector in a collaborative effort to build our resilience and respond to the impacts of climate change. So the studies indicated that mitigation has been receiving the majority of the funding for various reasons, including that it is a global imperative. Often this is left out. I think adaptation, on the other hand, although industrialized countries need to step up to the plate, particularly when it comes to financing, adaptation responses must be a local imperative, as the consequences are acutely felt on the ground, and this pressurizes the national fiscus. So the current view, I think, without, from the previous engagements, is that this fund should focus on a programmatic approach to climate change, where it supports beneficiaries appropriately in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage caused by climate change. And I think the thinking behind that and what has emerged through the discussions was that you would find that certain stakeholders thought that we might focus it in a specific area. And this is particularly dangerous. I think we require a holistic and much needed upgrade in an overall response. And if we try to focus, for example, in just dealing with disaster response, we actually are trying to fill a bucket with a sieve. So we need to fill all of those spaces in, plug all of those holes, so that eventually we have a holistic response to climate adaptation. So the second question is, who is this fund for, and under what circumstances does it come into play? I think there was a debate around the regional specificity based on vulnerability, the sector, or a focus responding to extreme events and disaster management, all of which are relevant and require attention. And it brings me back to the point where we require a programmatic approach. The outlook currently is that the fund must take a programmatic approach to adaptation, and must take a phased approach with a focus on areas where the risk and the vulnerability are at their highest and the opportunity for impact is maximized. Although this is the recommended approach, it must also be alive to the global opportunities presented throughout its approach, and be in a position to respond to these and maximize opportunities for adaptation response from the global arena for South Africa. The main areas of concern, given the series of events on the southeastern part of the country, where droughts and floods, consistently hit the same municipalities. We look at beneficiaries being municipalities, households, or businesses under these events, but also the ability to come in and build back better post these events. I think the third question we would like to address is, in this line of questioning, is how. How can climate change adaptation needs be met through a multi-stakeholder collaboration? And I think these need to be considered for inroads to be made in specific areas. Adaptation financing needs range from philanthropy, social outcomes investors, investments, impact first investors, concessional financing, and traditional investors. This is quite vast from when you look at kind of mitigation projects, and it makes the adaptation space more complex. The risk appetite and the investment outcomes of investors need to be understood. Fiscal inputs will be required, particularly for emergency response, but also to de-risk and catalyze other investor participation, particularly private sector. It must also offer a range of options for different investor risk profiles. This increases, like I said, the complexity of the proposed fund, but for this reason, a programmatic approach is suggested in developing such a fund. When we look, so the following section looks at macro level considerations and an overview of a potential preliminary approach to the fund. So the CCRF must provide a conduit between the climate financing architecture and the local context. So the global architecture and the local context. It must prioritize adaptation through a programmatic approach by averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And also, I think the deputy minister spoke about this. It includes responding rapidly to extreme events and addressing slow onset onset events from a gradual shifting climate. Thirdly, it must prioritize areas of vulnerability, risk, and highest impact. It must provide a platform for multi-stakeholder investment opportunities using innovative finance to incentivize participation from various stakeholders. It must advocate for the mainstreaming of climate change thinking and design its development through various interventions, including investment, proof of concept, as well as policy interventions. And it must be strategically located to ensure the swift and effective mobilization of appropriate responses. So if we move on to looking at the fund modalities. In this table, you will see that we have divided the fund basically into 6 potential buckets. And this is disaster response, livelihoods, loss and damage, build back better, adaptation, future-proofing, as well as mitigation, future-proofing. You will see that we have not left out mitigation because in some instances, I think there might be a need to fund certain projects where it might be fruitful to do so, or there is a dual impact between dual benefit between adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation mechanisms, so this kind of exercise has allowed us to undertake a high-level evaluation of each area or each bucket to understand the likely investors, the instruments, and the typical beneficiary focus. This table is by no means an extensive kind of investigation of that, but it gives an indication of which direction we might be heading in. I think this will also extend into the implementation partners and provide an indication of the risk profile for each bucket in terms of the investment. So adaptation responses are complex, and they do require an array of mechanisms and instruments and partners for adaptation to be effectively addressed. And finally, I think the next steps in the study will be it is envisaged that we will have engagements with the National Treasury and Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment to further engage this climate change response fund. The presentations on the key considerations and recommendations for this design will be discussed further, and possible modalities and approaches will be again further investigated. And I think the thinking behind it is that this climate change response fund could potentially form a pillar in developing a country platform for a more strategic and cohesive approach to climate change within the country. The country must continue to pursue diverse funding sources. It must enhance institutional capacity, and it must foster partnerships to build better resilience against climate change, particularly in the face of extreme events. Thank you very much, Desigan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mandy, and also the folk at the Bertha Center at the UCT Graduate School of Business, who have been doing this analysis in double time, because the PCC is always unreasonable about its time budget. And I should point out, thanks also to a very wide range of experts who have come into 2 very intensive sessions that we've had together to workshop a complex concept. So colleagues, we're going to go into the discussion space. So firstly, welcome to all of you on the call. And I've been running through the list on the chat. We have people who have immense expertise actually on the call with a long track record in engaging these issues. What we're going to do by way of modality is to move into a panel session first. And during the panel session, you are invited to put your questions up on the Q&A. And depending on the number that we get on that Q&A, we'll work out the right kind of modality around the engagement. It might be possible to get some of you to also speak to your questions that you put up. The trick would be to be very succinct, please. So the shorter and more compact your input is, the easier it is for us to pull it out and add it to the conversation. please put all your commentary into the chat, because the chat and the Q&A, in addition to the visuals, will be available as a record of this dialogue as we go forward. So a few words by introduction on the topic, and then I'm going to talk to the panelists. So we are at an interesting space. The president made this announcement in February this year. The budget policy statement of the Minister of Environment on behalf of the ministry, Dion George, put a timetable, and he talked about a CCRF at a point of functionality at the beginning of the next financial year. I'm pushing a bit on what he actually said, but that's broadly the timetable that we're talking about. We also have to take into cognizance the fact that we now have a Climate Act, and that Climate Act gives a legislative basis for our climate actions in South Africa. It's, in addition to the regulatory environment that it puts out, also talks about a support environment. And in addition to that is an invitation around multi-stakeholder engagement and participation in the way we roll out the South African agenda towards a lower carbon economy, and importantly, a much higher climate resilience economy. Because where we're sitting is the reality that even if we manage to get to the low carbon space in a much shorter period of time than is actually dictated by policy and practice, we would still have the issue of increased climate resilience needed for the next couple of decades at least. Some people say even longer than that. We're also talking to an environment that has a very mature conversation around climate finance. Now, we might not feel that way, but when South Africa compares itself to many other places in the world, the sophistication of the conversations we are having, the analysis with which we are having those conversations around developing the different instruments is a little bit ahead of the game for most parts of the world. We're also talking to an environment where the climate finance issue has moved beyond the UNFCCC. Let's be clear. So although we are applauding what the developing world has pushed for and achieved in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then got some momentum in Dubai, and hopefully even more momentum around modalities in Azerbaijan, and this is the Loss and Damage Fund, we still have a long way to go. So colleagues, we're going to start off with the panel, and we have 4 really excellent panelists. 2 of them partners to the PCC, 2 of them PCC commissioners. And I'm going to invite them in the following sequence and introduce them now so they can follow one on the other. And they're going to offer their opening gambits on this debate and talking in large part from the constituencies that they represent. So to kick off, we're going to have Obisa. And Obisa Magazi is from the National Treasury. You will know her well. She has been instrumental in many of the discussions around climate finance and more broadly around sustainability finance. And I'm going to hand it over to you just now, ma'am. But secondly, following immediately after her is going to be Joanne Bates. Joanne is a PCC commissioner. She's also the COO of the IDC, and is also instrumental in a much broader discussion over and above climate finance, and that's around the financial issues associated with our economic rejuvenation strategies and potentially our reindustrialization strategies. She's going to be followed by Janita Badal. Janita is from the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, the DFFE, and she engages in the issues around climate finance, but of course has an inside picture of the much broader strategy associated with both adaptation as well as mitigation and climate resilience inside the department. And then finally, we're going to have Jacques Hugo. Jacques is on the PCC, he's also from FDUSA. He has spent a lot of time examining issues from a worker and a fair workplace perspective, and he will complete the suite. So colleagues, I'm going to start off with Obisa. Ma'am, you have the floor.
Sure. Good morning, and thank you so much, Tish, again, and all the colleagues on the platform, and also greetings to the Honorable Deputy Minister. Before I do my opening remarks on the matter, I do also want to congratulate colleagues on the passing of the Climate Change Act. It has been long awaited, and we really anticipate that it's going to accelerate processes going forward. From the National Treasury point of view, we're really quite excited to be part of this discussion today, particularly because it's anchored around how do we as a country design comprehensive plans to address some of the challenges that we are faced with when it comes to issues around adaptation specifically. And we have been really looking forward to this conceptualization of the climate change financing modalities, etc. One of the things that we really quite mindful of or are interested in this debate and sort of dialogue on this matter is how do you bring all these different instruments together, particularly considering that there is an acknowledged problem at the center of this crisis, and that the public finances themselves are not sufficient to address the problem. So what sort of innovative financing mechanisms are we going to put forward as government to address some of these issues? What becomes the role of private sector, for instance, particularly looking into the insurance industry broadly? And also what is also quite critical in this discussion is the governance arrangements that are needed to institutionalize some of these financing modalities. We've seen in recent time, of course, there has been some preliminary recommendation that have been put forward by the PCC, particularly where it concerns the establishment of financing mechanisms, which we see this as a much more broader agenda on issues around just transition and climate change. But it then also warrants this discussion around which part of the systems do we want to accelerate, where in the system would these sort of institutions be sitting, for one, in the event that we are outlining institutions as well. One of the critical issues as well that we are hoping would be accelerated through these broadened discussions on these issues is how do we also take forward some of the work in relation to the disaster risk financing strategy that the National Treasury has been working with in partnership with the World Bank, for instance. So we are hoping that through this process as well, it will also accelerate discussions around that, especially when it comes to the forward-looking approaches on how to take that work forward and how to actually bring it to scale. In recent engagements, of course, with the PCC as well, specifically with the Director General of the National Treasury, has been also this discussion of what sort of reforms do we want to put on the agenda, particularly looking into our conditional grant systems, for instance, and what would be the relevant timeframes. We're just hoping that those are some of the issues that we can deliberate on. It might not be necessarily for the dialogue itself, but it's critical and quite pertinent for the discussion broadly on how we as a country respond to the issues around the climate change response fund, for instance. And quite critically, and I think it's something that we don't pay much attention to, Dishikan and colleagues, is the issue about the climate services. How do we, sitting at the center of government, ensure that there is sufficient prioritization, especially of some of those institutions that are looking into providing assistance in terms of infrastructural as well as predictive capabilities of the state and government broadly? And how do we actually create a value proposition for some of these institutions around the use of their services as a public good, for instance? I think that discussion has been in the making for the longest time, but we haven't really given it as much prominence in the discussion on issues pertaining to adaptation. And I think it's quite critical because it actually speaks to how we are being prepared as government in terms of addressing issues pertaining to disasters, as opposed to only responding to disasters when they occur. So, and I'm hoping that as part of the deliberations today, we will be also touching on some of those elements as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. That was absolutely excellent, and a wide variety of issues that were pulled into fairly sharply. Can we turn over to you, please, Joanne?
Thanks so much. And I mean, it's an interesting conversation because if I go back in my short time at the IDC over the last 5 years, we started with our first emergency scheme for the flood relief in KZN and the Eastern Cape. And that emergency scheme came together very quickly, looking at how we can support businesses. But very quickly, we understood the perpetual rain risk in the Northern Cape that had impacted the raisin farmers, and looked at a flood relief scheme for the Northern Cape. And the reality is we need better adaptation measures to ensure that we don't have emergency schemes, but we actually have preemptive programs in order to support communities to adapt and ensure through that we have more resilient both communities and industrial value chains. So I think what was very interesting was in the Northern Cape was the two contrasts. You've got the consistent rain that led to the challenges with table grape farmers, and as Hendrik pointed out, there's water schemes where the infrastructure just has not been maintained, which both creates risk to communities of access to water and also flood in the event of excess rain. So we really do need to think about resilient infrastructure in enabling adapted and sustainable industrial value chains. The IDC has launched a sustainable industrialization approach, looking at the integration of value chains and how we can ensure that we build for that economic resilience. Because the reality is, as much as we need to adapt as a result of environment, we really are ensuring that we adapt our economy in order to create sustained jobs, sustained exports, and sustained product and revenue for the country. So we have to have a holistic view in what we do and how we do it. I think looking at the funding pool, it's very easy to fund green infrastructure because everybody is clamoring to provide funding for what is often a government-backed program, but it becomes significantly more challenging when you're looking at adaptation and resilience finance. So we need to think holistically about how we leverage finance to support industries and opportunities. And how do we think very differently about building resilient value chains? So something we've identified is that food value chains might react very differently in different provinces and in different regions. So how do we as a region think about developing infrastructure, value chains, and businesses that support resilience not only of the community and the country, but also the region? So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Absolutely excellent. You've given us much food for thought and discussion as we move ahead. A quick reminder to our audience, thank you for the 3 questions that are up. Please feel free to add many more. We're now turning to Janita Vadal. Janita, over to you.
Thank you, Program Director. Good morning to Deputy Minister Singh, fellow panelists and participants joining in on the session. Upon reflecting on our ecological base in the country itself, South Africa is currently ranked 6th amongst the top 17 countries in the world in terms of being megabiodiverse. And it's actually home to 10% of flora and approximately 7% of fauna. Now, noting these statistics from a global perspective, we have to also pride ourselves in terms of the species which are endemic to South Africa, and it's inclusive of marine species, amphibians, plants, as well as invertebrates in varying degrees or percentages. In addition, we've also identified 9 biomes of significance in the country, and some of us on the line may be familiar as well with regard to the biomes. Now, as some of our panelists, as well as the Deputy Minister, have alluded to some of the climate risks in terms of frequency and severity of extreme weather events, the rising sea levels and increasing temperatures, these phenomena have definitely impacted negatively on shortened season cycles and further impacted on the life cycles of both fauna and flora, and invariably compromising on food security as well as our ecosystem services. And indeed, climate change has been identified as a key threat to biodiversity and our ecosystems. If one has to refer or reflect on the red data list, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is indeed cause for concern. We must also note that the contribution of ecosystem services and goods and services in monetary terms is estimated at approximately 73 billion per annum, which contributes to a percentage, 7% of the GDP for the country. Now, once these services are degraded or irreversible, it will certainly be too late for restoration. And whilst we talk of the Climate Change Response Fund, I agree fully that we have to take into consideration building back better and ensuring that it is climate resilient in the medium to long term. In terms of economic contributions, the services sector, more specifically tourism and ecotourism, contribute to at least 3% of the country's GDP. And you would note that it is quite dependent on our biodiversity and ecosystem services in terms of promotion of tourism in the country. Now, reflecting on the climate risks, which may have been mentioned earlier on, we have to take into consideration the impact on lives as well as livelihoods, the impact on community displacements and increasing levels of poverty, damage to the physical environment, as well as increased health risks, and the most recent being COVID-19, being a zoonotic disease. Now, both the social and economic disruptions push us to a point wherein we have to take into consideration how do we manage these disasters that are coming our way more frequently and with increasing severity. Natural disasters have been identified according to 4 categories: the geophysical, the meteorological, climatic, as well as hydrological. But what we need to be more cognizant of is that South Africa has witnessed one or the other in recent times in several of the provinces across the country. Now, this has resulted in both social and economic disruptions, and Gabisa as well as Joanne have spoken about the social impacts as well as building back better in terms of the economics and ensuring that there's resilience that has been considered in the medium to long term. With this in mind, managing disasters obviously requires for organization and directing resources to where it is needed most. The roles of and responsibilities of key players need to be identified, and I think that this is something that the CCRF will certainly seek to address as well. It begins to address it needs to begin to address what the critical gaps are, as well as be able to respond with speed. From lessons learned in establishment and operation of the National Green Fund, which the department still provides oversight on and has since handed over to the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we need to be very strategic in terms of how we position the fund. We have to take into consideration that it will definitely render the desired support, as well as ensure that the impact that it seeks to achieve in the short, medium, and long term are well defined. And it is indeed a learning curve because it's new to South Africa. But I think that if given the extent of consultations and the stakeholders with whom the PCC, together with other key stakeholders, have been reflecting on the fund itself, we will be able to reduce some of these unknowns based on experience. Now, the identification of vulnerable groups as well as vulnerable businesses determined by the extent of exposure or risk as a result of their business operations will also need to be determined, and how do we actually get them on a path that is more climate resilient. I think that in my opinion, in the short term, I see a twofold approach. Whilst Mandy has alluded to quite a few thematic areas that the fund will address, we have to look at, and she has mentioned this as well, responding to the immediate need and being able to respond with speed. And secondly, building resilience within both the business sector as well as community level. And lastly, in terms of the fund itself in the medium to long term, I think it will also demonstrate through settling in the introduction of other windows and also attracting other investors into the space. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janitha. You brought some valuable inputs associated with the biodiversity assets as well. We'll now turn over to Jacques Hugo. Jacques, the floor is yours.
Deputy Minister, Program Director, PCC ED, fellow commissioners and panelists and attendees, good morning. Yeah, indeed, a very interesting discussion this morning. The future of work and the future of jobs continue to generate a huge amount of discussion, both locally and internationally. And from the pandemic upending where and how we worked to the rise of automation and the generative AI, people are rightly divided into conversations on everything from quiet quitting, rage applying, or the great reshuffle. We have no choice but to fundamentally change how we work, and if we're going to save the planet and our way of life. Just transition is on the horizon for South Africa, claimed President Cyril Ramaphosa during his State of the Nation address earlier this year, when he announced the new Climate Change Response Fund. I quote, "The fund is a collaborative effort between the government and private sector to combat the increasing devastating impacts of the climate crisis. In recent years, the country has had to confront the effects of climate change. We have had devastating wildfires in the Western Cape, destructive floods in KwaZulu-Natal, and unbearable heat waves in the Northern Cape, persistent drought in the Eastern Cape, and intense storms in Gauteng. What will make this fund different?" I think that's a question that everybody is asking, and specifically from Labour. And I quote, "The fund will aim to build resilience to climate change with particular focus on food security, water security and infrastructure, and the built environment, as well as building response capability to extreme weather events. The fund is not a disaster response fund per se, but rather intended to make investments in sectors that build resilience to the effects of extreme weather events. Countries around the world have set ambitious targets to reach net zero by 2050, including South Africa. It's requiring a seismic shift across global and local economies and industries to change the way we do things. Both government and business are looking hard to how to drive this green transition further and faster, because we all know it's necessary. Government is setting the national direction, and organizations are reinventing their business models in order to play their part. Question is it fast enough? The good news is that we are seeing progress reflecting in the hiring of green jobs. Slow, yet it's happening. The World Economic Forum has made the following predictions. By 2030, up to 3.8% of total working hours will be lost because of climate-induced high temperatures. Poor air quality, disease-carrying pests, flooding and wildfires will also impact workers and lead to job losses. But the global transition to sustainable energy as well as climate change adaptation are expected to be the net job creators, according to the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs 2023 report. Of course, it's not just office workers that will mainly be impacted by outdoor workers, mostly agri, and related workers, mining and quarries, manufacturing, emergency responders, and people working in hot indoor environments. And it's not just extreme heat that workers will have to contend with. Poor air quality, disease-carrying insects, flooding, and wildfires are exacerbated by the climate crisis. Will also have a significant impact on workers' ability to carry out their jobs. The Greenpeace report says South Africa is home to 6 of the world's 10 largest nitrogen dioxide emission hotspots and 9 of Africa's 10 largest nitrogen dioxide point sources. What are the other potential challenges that the CCRF need to solve for, over and above the evident? Is it heat-related ill health, heat stroke and heat exhaustion? Respiratory illnesses where air quality will deteriorate and the climate crisis escalates. Physical and mental health impact for people on the front lines, such as firefighters and healthcare workers. the physical and physiological toll of dealing with fallout from extreme weather events is likely to be a heavy one. And the recent deaths in KwaZulu-Natal in those bushfires comes to mind. Diseases. With warmer temperature comes an increase in insects, which means more dangerous infections, mosquitoes, ticks, and other disease-carrying insects. Also spreading into areas previously deemed, for instance, as malaria-free areas. Pesticides-related impacts as a result of the increased insect increase, more pesticides are likely to be used. Extreme weather events as floods, droughts, wildfires, and damage will damage business assets, transport routes, and industrial and agricultural infrastructure that may lead to further job losses. The reason the Toyota plant closure for an extended period of time in Durban was a good example. After the massive floods in KwaZulu-Natal, social protection during this and other climate challenges was far from adequate. That saw workers pulling the short straw again. But it highlighted the large challenges with regards to our infrastructure in dealing with these events going forward. Labour is looking forward to the establishment of this fund, and as Designate earlier said, we're all hoping for 25-26 financial year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Colleagues, keep those Q&A moving. We'd like to see a few more, and we will create the space very shortly for that engagement. Our panelists have stuck to time in an unbelievable way. Maybe my emails were more threatening than I intended. So I'm going to return to them with a brief question each that they can expand on briefly, if you will. Let me start with Nobisa and go in the same order that we had before. One of the things that stuck out of your presentation that hasn't really been mentioned in too many other pathways, I mean, other discussions around climate finance, is how we can organize for addressing what is essentially a global emergency and to a very large degree, a sub-regional disaster that we're dealing with in the form of climate change, to actually, one, accelerate our finance partnerships with various partners of the country. And the second thing you said was the possibility of this also catalyzing a grant reform process inside the country. It'd be really useful if you could expand on that just a little bit.
Thank you so much, Deshiken. So what I would reflect on, and especially in the context of at least the most recent engagement that we've been having with some of the partners, especially in the context of the JTIP, one of the things that they've been really impressing upon the National Treasury is the need for us to better demonstrate how the funding that exists in the system is flowing to the localities or the most vulnerable, for instance. And what are the systems that we are putting in place to, for one, track that sort of funding and all? I think that for me is quite a critical a change in the traditional way of doing things, especially when it comes to developmental loans, for instance, and some of these policy laws that we have received in recent time. In that ordinarily, what money would have come into the system would not require that sort of transparency to the extent that we at the center as the National Treasury would have to actually demonstrate the ultimate beneficiary of some of the resources. How is that relevant then in the context of the discussion that we're having? It then says that from sitting at the center as the National Treasury, these are serious considerations going forward, and especially if we are going to be mobilizing additional resources, and that we equally then need to strengthen our transparency systems in terms of demonstrating who then is the ultimate beneficiaries of some of this funding. From a fiscal incident point of view, we then need to ensure that we have systems that are actually enhancing such, which then becomes quite critical in terms of how we are thinking of rolling out our climate budgeting process for one, in that it becomes a useful tool in demonstrating where the money is sitting in the system, particularly then in the context where we're also trying to build this narrative about how do we then ensure that the money, particularly for adaptation, is flowing to the right areas as well. When it comes to the issues around disasters, disaster financing, as well as the conditional grants, there is a process underway wherein the National Treasury is reviewing some of the conditional grants framework. We are hoping that, and especially having had the climate symposium that was held a few weeks ago, that we can now go back and revisit how we can actually expedite some of that work. The idea, though, obviously, we still need to check the practicality of some of these things. Obviously, you would be mindful that when it comes to local government specifically, we have a different fiscal year, in that though some of these announcements might be ready, or maybe there might be some indication of readiness by the time we reach the MTBPS, it might not be the case for some. As I had mentioned in my preamble earlier on, we are working in a broadened context of the disaster risk financing, looking as well into those conditional grants, and with the view of trying to reform them to give articulation to these issues about resilience. So I'm hoping, and we are hoping as colleagues, that at least by the time we reach the MTBPS, there will be some recommendations that can be put forward, but being mindful, of course, that some of these things may be linked to the fiscal year of our IGR and local government space as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed. I'm sure that's going to provide help to a large number of folk who are hoping that, one, we have a more transparent grant system, and two, that the channeling to the right beneficiaries in an efficient and responsible way is what's going to help us to be in a much better space. Thank you so much for that. Joanne, can I go over to you? And the thing that popped out is something that has been in the commentary of some folk when we were talking to the Climate Act, and that is the possibility of organizing for, if you like, a resurged industrialization, a new climate resilient industrialization as the much broader part of reviving the South African economy. And the second part that you added to that is you've got to have a regional outlook. You can't close your eyes and just remain in your political borders. That's really profound. Maybe you can expand on that just a little bit.
Thanks. And so in looking at industrial pathways, and I find it very difficult to talk about industrial pathways without mentioning critical infrastructure. So, I mean, as we know, some of the effects of the floods in Durban and the congestion and the impact that has had on economic activity. We also know the global demand for cleaner, greener products. So it really is thinking about resilient, clean, green infrastructure that enables these industrial pathways. But in looking at, so we started off looking at the green industrial pathways to say, what are those critical green industries that we can invest in for economic enhancement? And what we saw coming out of that is a lot of the green industries are actually enabling traditional industries. So how do we think about, I mean, food security? I'll actually just limit the feedback to food security, which is, you know, a global challenge. There's not an insufficiency of food, but it's having food in the right places that is the key challenge. So in looking at the agricultural value chains, it's understanding the processing as well as production of agricultural produce. So where optimally should we be planting based on weather patterns, changing rainfall? WWF did significant work together with Sanlam a number of years ago to assist Sanlam in understanding the insurance risk in their portfolio. So the data exists. What we need to ensure is that there's greater access to data in order to ensure that we have data-informed decisions on where to establish industrial and agricultural capacity. You know, we often look at agriculture as being the quick fix in the just transition to create jobs and livelihoods for communities. But do we understand the right scientific practices that need to be deployed in order to ensure that those communities will have resilience resilient agriculture as opposed to just short-term or subsistence agriculture. So aligned to the agricultural pathways, we're looking at aggregation models, because what we don't want is a future that is purely large agriculture, large businesses, science and data empowered. But how do we ensure that the small businesses, the regional farmers, the community farms have access to the same level of data and insights to ensure that on a shared model, they can implement best resilience and adaptation practices so that they have sustainable livelihoods and can feed into larger agricultural value chains. On the regional basis, what we've also seen is that when we have an El Nino or El Nino and El Nino cycles, different countries and different regions in Southern Africa are impacted differently. So when we're having droughts in one place, we have abundant rain in others. So how do we think about a regional food security and capacity? So when you are establishing manufacturing or processing capacity, how do you do it on a regional basis to ensure that livelihoods are not impacted in down cycles, but are sustained through the cycle? So it really is thinking about how we plan for through the cycle economies, as opposed to purely, solving the problem when it arrives. I hope that helps.
That helps a great deal, an absolute great deal. And the last point that you made around the non-linearity of these major global weather movements is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, the El Nino that is just passing has given us both droughts and floods at the same time in one region. And that's part of the complexity of the new planning. Absolutely excellent. Colleagues, before we go to Janita and Jacques Hugo, I just want to alert John Matwasa, Hendrik Lowe, Errol Andile Mlambo, Mizuke Nondangwa, Mohsin Khan, and Sarah Bracking. You put questions. Oh, and one more, Nkosanati Sabia. You put questions in the Q&A, and we're going to give you an opportunity just now to address the panel with your questions. You are required to please put up your hand on that button, and that way the tech guys will recognize you, and we'll come to you just now. But first I want to go over to Janita. And Janita, I just want you to expand on something that has been really incredible, and that's the issue around the fund and how the fund can help to secure our biodiversity asset in particular, but more broadly, the ecological assets that exist in this country and this region. Maybe you can expand on that just a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jessica. What's important is that we need to firstly appreciate the ecological base that we have in South Africa itself, very unique biomes as well. Now, in trying to replace what we've lost, that becomes a challenge if we are reactive rather than proactive. And this is something that Joanne also mentioned from a business perspective, or taking up opportunities within the industry sector as well. Being able to actually be proactive and start looking at the species that are most impacted upon or most vulnerable, and starting to address that. And a few years ago, just by way of example, through the Green Fund, we looked at a particular bird species, which was no longer prevalent in the Highveld, and we tried to ensure that we could actually reintroduce it to other provinces, given its support in terms of assistance with cattle farmers and removal of ticks. So it's a very practical example from a livestock perspective, but the impact of the bird species playing that significant role to farmers itself on a daily basis obviously goes unnoticed until the bird species has been extinct. So taking this into consideration, the rehabilitation of different species, whether it is the fauna or the flora, have to be put in place prior to reaching a point where they are now on the red data list. I think the purpose of the red data list with the endemic species provides us with guidance on, where things are at and how severe the impact has been in terms of climate change. We can't reverse it, but you will have other hybrids that will come in place as well. And this being said, we have to take into consideration the fact that with the introduction of new species, there could be new problems that may arise as well. Therefore, focusing on the species that are endemic, both the plant as well as the animal species, it's key for us to ensure that we are able to protect them and be more proactive in our approach rather than reactive. Now, in terms of identification from an international perspective, there are several institutions that actually take that into consideration, and one of it being UNESCO, identifying environmental as well as cultural heritage and placing them under significant support would actually raise the awareness around the endemic species as well as the cultural diversities that are present in these particular areas, where we could leverage on it in the future. And South Africa has quite a few of these UNESCO sites as well. Let me stop there, Desigan. I'm not sure if there's any follow-up to that. Thanks.
No, that's great. We still want some space to engage our colleagues on the chat. And Deputy Minister Singh, if you're still around, maybe after Jacques Hugo, we can give you an opportunity for a few comments as well. But let me go straight to...
Thank you.
Thank you. Jacques, one of the things that really popped out in your opening remarks was that you talked about the thing that we all talk about, and that's around an increasingly more difficult work environment, in addition to an increasingly difficult living environment for workers, and the possibility of, together with the 4IR, having serious cuts in jobs. But you also pointed out from the WEF reports that climate resilience could in fact work in the other direction and create many more jobs and maybe more sustainable jobs going into the future. It would be really useful to hear a little bit more about that.
Again, thank you. Yeah, just maybe first before I get into those opportunities, what we're already discussing amongst labor is the fact that with the increasing temperatures, is our Occupational Health and Safety Act and our Mine Health and Safety Act, is it sufficient in terms of addressing these higher temperatures going forward, and all of those related things around the higher temperatures at the place of work? We've seen, unfortunately, some agricultural workers losing their job or losing their lives in the Northern Cape because of those extreme heat waves that we had in the Northern Cape. Is it possibly now the opportunity to sit down around the table, for instance, at NEDLAC, to say, listen, we need to carefully look at these regulations and maybe tightening up and devising some ways around these challenges that is not easily abated, around the world of work. So that's some of the things that we're pondering about and concerned about going forward. Creating jobs in the green industries is something that we dream of. As I've mentioned in my reply, or my input, is that we are seeing some of it happening, but unfortunately, within the South African context, the losses in jobs currently is not made up by these so-called green jobs. And we need to seriously look at how we can accelerate those programs where the green jobs would start. When we look at it at a net zero loss in terms of jobs, we need to start accelerating that. And I think this fund would be one. Some of the initiatives that are taking place in a number of the government departments in terms of ensuring that we addressing the green future will hopefully create those opportunities. Unfortunately, with the very, very high levels of unemployment, our members and labor are clinging onto those jobs for dear life that they currently got. And unfortunately, it's not a question of let's work towards the future. whilst we're battling to get a bread on the table today. Just if I may, Desik, and my apology for being maybe a bit out of place, but you know, one of the things that I forgot to mention in my presentation is the fact that one of the things that we would like to see from this fund is its ability in terms of speed to response. In other words, if there's a challenge that arose, that the decision for this fund to be able to assist don't get bogged down in passages and in boardrooms, and then 4 years later say, yes, we've got the solution. So part of this fund, I think, is that ability to firstly identify those areas in terms of where we need to improve on the infrastructure to be able to manage what's currently happening in the Western Cape. My apology for being long-winded, but I mean, the Western Cape just got their whole season's rain within 3 weeks. And we've seen all the major dams in the Western Cape are overflowing. If we had dams lower down, we would have been able to catch all of this excess water to ensure that we build resilience in terms of possible droughts coming. So those are some of the things that we need to be able, that this fund needs to be able to stimulate as well. My apology for being long-winded.
No, that's perfect. That's really an important contribution. And the whole idea that we're talking about a fund not only smart in characterization, but an important modality is the ability to use useful, transparent, and responsible mechanisms, but rapid response. Absolutely key. Thank you very much indeed. Deputy Minister, if you want a few minutes now to offer some further reflections, you are most welcome, sir.
Yes, I think am I there? Right. No, thank you very much.
I cannot see you, sir.
Oh, you cannot see me. You know what I look like. We've met before. Right, now you can see me. We've met on many occasions before. Thank you. And no, thank you very much for this opportunity. I must say this is a very, very enlightening discussion. And I'm learning a lot, as I'm sure many others. But I just want to pick up on where Jacques left in, about the ability to respond, because, if we have a fund and it's well-resourced, I think the ability of government agencies, departments to respond to disasters is something that we cannot be very proud of. And sometimes one asks the question, why do NGOs like the Gift of the Givers and other NGOs respond as fast as they do when there are disasters? And yet we have government departments who should be well prepared to respond and have strategies to get onto the ground as quickly as possible. So I think that's something you can look at, why is our response as late as it is? Secondly, I think that, listening to Kobisa Makazi from National Treasury, I appreciate the fact that they're looking at conditional grants, how they operate, what they should be used for, etc., because we are looking here at the impact of climate change on communities post a disaster. But there can be, and I like the words being used, proactive, preemptive, mitigating the risks. I mean, I still fail to understand. I attended a conference on the environment about 25 years ago in Port Elizabeth, I think, where the CSIR had done some projections on floods and the impact of floods on communities. And, it actually showed in 3D how if there was, not excessive rain, but if there was rains, it would impact on people that are allowed to settle in floodplains. But we still do it even now. So where does local government come in? Where does town planning come in? It might be a bit too late in some areas where we've had the damage. But we know, Desigan and Dr. Olver and others, that urban sprawl is an international phenomenon. People move from one province to another. I heard some commentary a few days ago, people moving from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape for job opportunities, and they just settle anywhere because they have no other place to settle, and they go into floodplains, they go into areas where the soil is not good, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. And, I was in Inanda a few years ago where I saw the damage, the horrific damage done to these traditional huts that were just swept down banks which were not suitable. I mean, the soils were not suitable for them to be constructed there. And, up to today, there are still people missing from those floods. So the preemptive, proactive stances, I think it's got to start there with local government, with town planning, with infrastructure, with maintenance of infrastructure, because even in urban areas, you find that houses are flooded because drainage is not maintained. So the fact that people are going to move from one province to another, or from a rural area to an urban area for economic opportunities is going to be here for life. But how do we cater? The Department of Human Settlements is not in a position to provide adequate housing for people that come in on an ad hoc basis. Now, what preparations, what plans, how much of land do we set aside within urban areas and say this land is suitable for us to put in basic services, and temporary homes can be constructed? We do that after the impact of a disaster. Now, I think there's a lot more, and I'm glad this is the first round of discussions focusing on the funding, but I think other things need to be attended to, before we actually look at the impact and the causal effects of climate change. Fishing, I mean, I saw the other day, was it in some area in Africa, where people are losing their livelihoods from catching fish. That is their food source, because the fish are moving into deeper waters because of the warm waters along the coast. So I think these are issues that, coming from the ground and the constituency level, are things that we need to focus, while the bigger picture of getting funds needs to continue, very aggressively. Thank you very much, Desika.
Thank you, sir. That was really well taken. And I think you pulled together some of the practical aspects of what we're needing to do really, really well. Colleagues, we're now going to open up to the folk who pegged on the Q&A. I don't have visibility of the hands. I'm hoping that Ntabiseng does. And I'm going to call out the names in a particular order, and she's going to unmute your mic. And you should be able to see your mic being unmuted, and then you can take the floor. But firstly, a quick question, answer to Clement's question. Clement Mapudi, there isn't an allocation yet, Clement. This work is part of defining the concept and putting in the budget option to Treasury during the current cycle, so that we actually have a fund that will live and breathe, as Minister George wants, at the beginning of the next financial year. This does not mean other instruments will not be used as stopgap measures in between. So, colleagues, if I can call out, the first person maybe is Sarah Bracking. Sarah, are you able to be unmuted?
Yes, I'm hoping I already am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. The question I posted was really about the risk of a climate fund becoming a silo. So everybody sort of concentrates on a very small amount of money generally, because there's not much money in climate finance, either locally or globally. And in so doing, there's an opportunity cost that you don't mainstream climate resilience in other key ministries, such as housing, energy, and transport. So, for example, the best way to do climate resilience is to start to change immediately the way that you build houses, or the way that you build transport systems. And so my question really to the Minister is there a risk of the opportunity cost that everybody focuses on a very small pot of money, while climate resilience isn't mainstreamed in the much, much bigger departmental budgets of the other ministries?
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed. The panel will respond to you shortly. Can I move now to Errol Mlambo. Errol, are you with us?
Thank you very much. Good morning. So my question was very, was easy on the presentation by Mandy when she was speaking on the fund modalities. So especially on the insurance, and I just wanted to know where would you place the insurance? Will it be on the insurance institutions or municipalities? And I'm asking this because, for instance, in municipalities, I stay in Ekurhuleni, and I believe our municipality understands the population, the census of who we are. For instance, here we have a mix. We have the industrial part of Ekurhuleni, we have the suburbia, we have the CBD, we have the township, and we have informal settlement. Should there be a disaster like it happened in KZN, they would know quicker, the municipalities, how to address it because they understand the special planning, the infrastructure, like the Deputy Minister was alluding earlier on. They would respond quicker. So I just wanted to understand, where would you place the insurance fund? Would it be through like Joanne was speaking about Sanlam and etc. Would you place it with those institutions or municipalities? Thank you very much.
Good question, because you don't want to increase your climate inequality also in your response. Good question, thank you. Then we can move to Gugu Mashlangu, a regular attendee of our PCC dialogues. Are you able to get on?
Yes, thank you. I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is okay. So my question was with regards to implementation. Especially I'm from Witbank, born and bred, and there's a lot of talks around how we going to actually get assisted, because right now it's more focused on the energy sector, rightly so. But however, we feel that agriculture should also be on the table with regards to how we're going to be supported to actually make a climatic difference. Currently, projects that are going on where I'm from is smart farming solutions, which is great. But people are more pressed about the contamination in terms of our water, the contamination in terms of our land, and how we're going to be able to extract that. So I guess the question would be, will the fund be address those issues, or will that be steered to the people responsible, which is the mining sector? Yeah, so that would be my question.
That's a very good question. It's quite a challenging question. Thank you for that. Then we can go to Richard Worthington. Richard, you put two on the chat. Maybe you can either combine them or talk to one.
Hi, thanks very much. Yeah, no, just the issue about electricity, I guess, because, building resilience in communities, doing adaptation programs intended to benefit the most vulnerable, this requires access to modern communication technologies and therefore access to electricity. And I'm not suggesting that the Climate Change Response Fund should now take that on, but it remains a massive gap. And so a lot of the work that the fund would support would, to reach everybody, require access to electricity being universal. And yesterday Minister Ramaphosa said, oh yes, off-grid electricity, it's very important, and Eskom is doing that under Mr. Bala. And that does not provide me with much reassurance that we have a programmatic approach to achieving universal access to electricity, which is an essential underpinning for adaptation. So within this broader discussion, as the Representative Magazi from the Treasury alluded, there's this broader landscape. And so what I'm talking about also is relevant to this review they're doing of how we fund these essential things. And so I'm just thinking that in this broader discussion, we really do need to have some way of ensuring that a programmatic approach is taken to ensuring universal access to electricity as an enabler for all the other good work that is happening and consistent with the principles of just transition. So I guess it's more of a pitch than a question, but if people would like to reflect on what assumptions might have been or what might be happening in that space, that's welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. So if at all, how can this response fund stimulate this convergence of the climate agenda and the SDGs largely. Perfect, thank you. We can go now to, I see Mzuki and Nkosanati, you're both from the same institution. I don't know if one of you wants the floor.
Greetings. My name is Nkosanati Sidi from Advocates for Climate Justice South Africa. There seemingly to be a consensus that climate change further exacerbates the challenges that are already prevailing in society, like unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Now, it then wants you to imagine how best can we ensure that the fund addresses also the underlying needs of marginalized communities and the vulnerable population in the context of climate change, as well as these challenges that are already existing in society. And how best could we ensure that local communities and civil society organizations effectively engage with the fund? Because we might have a funding that is centralized at a certain level, but end up not serving the purpose, mainly because the people who are affected on a daily basis are not part and parcel of the agenda, and there is no way how they interact with the fund. Mostly, the fund seeks to speak into an entrepreneurial side of the perspective. How do we address also the social issues that are attached to the matter? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Excellent. Thank you. Muhsin Khan. Okay, we're not finding Muhsin, so we can go to Hendrik Lowe, please.
Okay, looks like I'm unmuted. Thank you very much. Yes, the questions I've had was posted fairly early on, and I'm glad to see that many did address it to some extent. But it's very much in line with what Sarah is saying. And it's really two things for me. Is firstly, a lot of the impact that we see due to climate change is actually due to the lack of things like management and maintenance of stormwater systems, etc. So those things will have to be fixed first. And I definitely I would not like to see this fund used for things like that is supposed to happen in government in any event, number one. And secondly, many of these options that we have to mitigate the impact that climate change has can be integrated directly into regulations. Like, for instance, water runoff, to make sure that wherever you build, etc., there are things in place already that is integrated in regulations to make sure that you mitigate the risk should floods come, etc., from the very start. Otherwise, you're just going to keep on having to do risk management afterwards. Risk management should be done beforehand. So how is this going to happen? Will this form part of it? And how will this be enforced? Because a lot of things are in place, but they're definitely not enforced. So will this now become a freebie so that some departments can do what they were supposed to do from the start? Yes or no?
Okay, thank you very much for that, Hendrik. I can tell you that the things you've raised are sitting in some important places. One is the new strategy from the DWS on climate response for the water sector, water and sanitation sector. It's also in a few papers that are already being published by the PCC, and another one that is coming up pretty soon. So there is a lot of effort going into thinking this through in a fundamental way. In terms of saying, Muhsin said he couldn't get unmuted. Could we try him again?
Muhsin.
Khan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. Thanks. I think just to my point, and I'm at one of the private IPPs, And just really interested in understanding this climate change response fund. These conditional grants, is there any focus or appetite to consider having these conditional grants available to IPPs who target specific affected sectors and perhaps segueing into, potential, if I could call it, economic social development within the broader communities that could be impacted? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you so much indeed. And we're going to go to one more person who's put a note on the chat, but Richard Sherman, if you're still awake in the US, maybe you would want to offer a few comments as well, quickly. But the next person I'm going to is John Matwaza. John, are you winning?
It doesn't seem to be online anymore. But
all right, we've lost John. That's okay. Richard, are you managing to get in with us? And thanks for joining at a ridiculous hour where you are.
Hi, Desigan. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, buddy. Please
Yes,
go on.
Good morning, everybody. And thanks for the PCC for having this dialogue. So I think one of the lessons that we're learning very quickly is what somebody had alluded to is the response time, right? So in our assessment at the global level, unless we have prearranged finance, right? And that doesn't mean insurance, it could mean a range of, an event happens, this is the response, this is the allocation of money. If we have these systems in place, at the global level, we could disperse funding within 6 days. If we don't have these systems in place, we're looking at anywhere between 4 to maybe 16 weeks, right? So that qualifier suggests we failed because the response to loss and damage must be immediate and it must be separate to the humanitarian responses, right? So this would be funding provided, hopefully on the concessional level, some cases grant level, in the event of a disaster happening. So I think the tendency right now is to have that system work through the sort of direct budget support metrics that the MDBs really use. So that would be money going directly through National Treasury and then Treasury acting as, in a sense, the fund agent in a country level for them to disperse to whether it's municipalities or local communities. So that's the current thinking right now. Obviously, this changes if we go from $700 million that we currently have to the 100 billion to 400 billion that is expected for us to respond to. So obviously that will then change. So I think we are there. The issue of how communities would access the fund gain, we are in discussions with the World Bank that will host the Secretariat of the fund to look at other models. It's very complicated for the World Bank to directly put money into communities. So therefore, there may be a conditional element on money to national treasuries to ensure that money flows to the ground. But again, this is a component of our governing instruments. So in my mind, the flatter the structure, the more nimble the approach is really important, but we need to sort out where our priorities will be. We know that we'll never get that correct. There will be we will need to be able to have prearranged responses as well as an ability for a secretary to come in and support a country in case we didn't cover something. There will be data gaps. We know all these things. So I mean, we're hoping that we could start dispersing small pots of money by January or February next year. But for our funds, the global fund, to be fully operational by the middle of 2025. And so there's intersection between what we do at the global level and what South Africa decides to do. Is its modality that you want to use is really, really important. So happy to contribute and thank you for having this event.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. Colleagues, just to remind you, Richard sits on the interim board and quite possibly the permanent board of the Loss and Damage Fund that we referred to earlier, that part that was sunk in Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP27. Colleagues, very rich comments, all of which are going to be considered for incorporation into the paper that the PCC will be publishing after it has a sitting in its September round. But now I want to return to the panel, and this time I'm going to be a little bit cruel. You really have 1 minute for your final statement. So you can respond to something you've heard, or you can organize to offer your final remarks on this, even without responding to the questions. So we'll start in the order that we began, and Obisa, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tishik. I'm opting to respond to some of the issues that I saw on the chat for one. There was a specific question that was asked regarding the interlink between the Climate Change Response Fund and the disaster risk financing. I think it needs, and I would need to clarify the fact that in terms of the DFR, there are 3 priorities that we have set for that sort of work. One, the objective of increasing the availability of funds. The second being the objective of improving the ability to distribute funds. And then, of course, the third element that looks into data collection, etc. So within that, this is an overarching strategy. It does then provide certain metrics of the sort of instruments that are required broadly to support that strategy. And though originally obviously not contemplated within the context of having a climate change response fund, we would have to find ways of how to actually introduce the fund into that mix of issues, etc. Obviously, that work has been done independently and quite advanced. But I have during the course of the call been engaging with the colleagues who are leading that work to say, what is the possibility of then creating these interlinkages, if at all? But they said they would have to consider and look into that and provide as part of the feedback around the DFR and the recommendations that we're taking forward. Some of these recommendations will be included in the MTBPS, but I don't foresee that in their entirety, given the fact that they are still being consulted with the relevant stakeholders. There was also an issue about who should actually and where should the insurance sit. I think we need to be mindful, and I think in the context of municipalities as well, in that municipalities generally have very limited room in terms of contingent liabilities. And they also have very limited room in terms of guarantees and the ability to borrow and approach the capital markets, given the fact that they are largely borrowing on the strength of their own balance sheets. So we need to also then think about the role of such state insurance, such as your SASRIA, in a broader metrics of thinking about institutions and the sort of funding that is required to support issues around disaster, which I think it's linked to the points that Richard was making in a South African context. So we need to then elevate the sort of roles of those sort of institutions as well. There was another question that was posed, which I just want to briefly respond to, around the climate services and what should be actually targeted in terms of that. In my own opinion, and please don't quote me at it, I think we do need to follow through, and some of early work that has been done, such as work that was done by GTEC around creation of a value proposition on institutions such as SOARS, institutions such as SANZA and others, in really demonstrating and trying to build a case about how do we strengthen the research and modeling capabilities of South Africa in terms of our prediction capabilities and all. And it's also about really looking through a consolidated lens, what parts of the systems do we need to strengthen when it comes to weather monitoring, etc. And also, quite critically, when it comes to governance requirements, is to the extent that some of these functions are in fact concurrent functions, where and what part of the systems do we need to strengthen, and who must assume responsibility for what aspect of the work, particularly if we are building a value proposition that says this is primarily a public good than it is a private good. So I just wanted to pause there and to just offer some response to some of the questions. Obviously, some of the things we can take bilaterally or by email as well. Thank you.
Excellent, Obisa. You have no idea how happy we're getting on your last statement. The PCC is at a fairly advanced stage of actually creating the business case that you're talking about. So in the next couple of months, it will be on your desk. So let's go over to you, Joanne.
Thanks. I hope you're equally enthused by my comments. So I think my just listening more to the commentary and reading some of the questions, I think the thing that comes to mind is, let's not expect the fund to be the silver bullet. The fund will have a very specific role that it will play and that it can play, but it is not going to solve every challenge and every circumstance. So just picking up on three pieces, the point made around, ensuring that this fund doesn't do the job of ministries. So if there is an allocation to ministries, let's ensure that government does its job, government, both local and all spheres of government. But at the same time, let's ensure that we have collectively defined the job to be done, so that funds that are spent with impact, as opposed to spent against departmental budget, because we don't always solve the problems with the money we spend, which means that our money as a country doesn't go as far as it could actually achieve impact. Secondly, on the mining sector, so I'm finding challenges on both public and private. On the mining sector, it's easy to say that the mining sector needs to be held accountable, and they absolutely should be. But in Mpumalanga, in looking at an acid mine drainage and desalination solution a number of years back, what we found was the significant number of abandoned mine shaft that is no one's real responsibility other than governments, again, at great cost to the government. So how do we think about solving for acid mine water as a collective of private sector and public sector in a PPP arrangement to ensure that we solve the problem as opposed to allocating responsibility? And I think finally on the insurance side, let's ensure that, again, where it comes to allocation of building permits or allowing people to settle, there was a comment made earlier about, I think by the Deputy Minister, on some settlements that we know people are settling below the 50-year floodline. There are municipal permits given for buildings and industrial parks to be developed in below the 50-year floodline. So one of the things that stood out for me in the flood relief funding in KZN is that there were a number of businesses that will not be able to get insurance for their business operations because they are operating out of premises that are below the 50-year floodline. So that's where we need to ensure that insurance and government work together, that we don't allow at-risk infrastructure to be built, because that makes it uninsurable. And government shouldn't then be the insurance behind that, because it doesn't create a sustainable model. So we really need to think with intent, ensure the right people take the right risks, that we work together in defining and solving the risks, and allow this fund to fulfill its purpose and not be challenged by trying to solve everything. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Janita.
Thanks, Desigan. I just wanted to pick up on 2 points. The first one, based on what Richard has indicated, I would want to add that the fund, once operational, needs to close the gap, firstly. Secondly, be transparent in nature. Thirdly, establish credibility. And then lastly, ensure that the fund benefits the vulnerable groups. And this is something that Richard indicated at the global level is an area that they are still addressing in terms of how do the funds actually reach the communities and the beneficiaries at that level. The second one, based on some of the comments that have been provided by the participants, it should not be a business as usual. We have quite a few funds that are in existence, and therefore positioning the fund is what's going to differentiate it from other existing funds. And just a food for thought, I'm just wondering, how is it that we would actually be able to provide support to transitioning industries? This is a key area of concern from the industry's perspective in terms of all of the levies and all of the taxes that are being imposed on industry itself. But nonetheless, the support that's required in terms of R&D and access to seed funding to transition their industries, how do we address this? Because at the end of the day, in the medium to long term, we're trying to establish climate resilience. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then Jacques.
Thank you. And I must say, this is a very, very interesting discussion. And I can see that everybody around the table has got the same intended outcomes for this fund, to being able to meet where it needs to meet where those challenges originate from. But Desigan, I think you heard me when I was long-winded in terms of the fund's ability to respond with speed. And I think this fund has also got the ability to close that trust gap, that deficit that we've got between government and communities and workers at large. In other words, if we have the ability to put this fund together, that it's able to meet those needs with the appropriate interventions, and add to that a dash of speed, we will be able to close that trust gap deficit by a big margin. So I guess it's about communities and workers experiencing firsthand how things can work. So I guess that's one of the desired states of this fund. Thank you.
Excellent, absolutely excellent. Colleagues, we're going to delay you just a little bit longer and have our executive director offer the closing remarks. Crispian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Des. And I must say thank you, a deep vote of thank you to the Deputy Minister and to all of our panelists and participants for an amazingly rich discussion. And as you know, many of you have pointed out, we're seeing now, already the physical climate impact that, we were talking about, a decade ago. It's now real. And it's very clear that we need to be doing substantive investment in building our long-term resilience, investments in water security, in food security, in agriculture, in infrastructure and the built environment, in climate services and early warning systems, and in our disaster response capability. And we're talking about this, mindful of the fact that adaptation has got some very particular challenges. It's the stepchild of climate finance. Only 12% of the climate finance in South Africa is going to adaptation. We've also got projects that are, not traditionally commercial in the way that, for instance, energy and renewable energy and battery technology projects are. So you've got much lower levels of bankability, and you correspondingly need, much higher levels of grant and concessional money. There's also, a lot of adaptation projects are smaller in nature. Many of them are community resilience initiatives. They've got smaller ticket sizes. And we've also, very mindful that the pipeline of projects for adaptation is actually underdeveloped. So, reflecting on this, I think we've got a couple of real strengths as a country. First of all, we've got a really well-articulated climate change adaptation strategy that DFFE put out. I'm very mindful that it's a great strategy, but we're not implementing it. So, as I understand, of the 95 actions that the strategy set out, we've only implemented 28 of them. We've got a great level of commitment from National Treasury. I must say, Gobisa has only recently concluded hosting this Climate Resilience Summit that Treasury convened. And she and her team have been doing work on mainstreaming climate stuff across the budget process, including very innovative work on climate budget tagging. And, she was talking earlier about their disaster risk financing work. So that's a real strength, and very few countries are quite at the level that we're at. And you're also seeing these growing global commitments, not enough yet, but, it's very important that, we've set up the Green Climate Fund, even though it's not properly funded. We've now got an agreement to set up the Loss and Damage Fund. Richard is representing South Africa on that fund. These are very important developments. the big challenge that we face in designing this fund is how do we bring sectors into the financing system that we haven't done before? And particularly, how do we bring private debt and private equity and contributions from the insurance industry behind the broad adaptation work that we need to do. And, also the development finance institutions. How do we get the multilateral development banks, critical national DFIs like the IDC and the DBSA? How can we get them, more firmly behind adaptation? And that means we've got to, invest in properly structuring projects and doing the financial structuring that needs to sit behind them. And you've also posed, I think, a number of other challenges for us. How do we do it quickly? How do we make sure that we've got responsive delivery mechanisms that can deal with the immediacy of climate crises as they unfold? And also, how do we make sure that this is bottom-up and responsive? How do we give effect to the just transition principles that we committed to as a country and really bring, a multi-stakeholder approach that taps the capacities that, a whole range of actors, workers and communities and NGOs and private funders, how do we get them working together around making this funding flow? So, when the president announced the fund, he, very importantly said, I want this as a partnership, and I want you to explicitly bring the private sector into these funding arrangements as we go forward. So thank you for this engagement. I mean, I think it's really been rich, and it's laid a very solid basis for the team to go away and take the document forward. And Des, I hope there will be more such conversations before the recommendations from the PCC get actually submitted. I think there'd be an enormous amount of interest among stakeholders in shaping them further. So, maybe we can have a follow-up discussion once there's a draft on the table. And with that, thank you, and have a great day further.
Thanks very much, Crispy, and thank you everybody for your attendance and participation. We are going to keep you very occupied in the next couple of months. Thank you. And thanks, Deputy Minister.
Thank you. Pleasure.